Hello there, I'm Jin, and this is a ball lightning build that utilizes the Fireball enchantment for fast clearing, which is especially handy in vaults, nightmare dungeons, and overworld content. It also packs enough of a punch for soloing and teaming bosses like Big Maggot Guy and Screamy Flying Girl. Before we get to the build, if you do like this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell to help this little channel grow. Many thanks, now to the build. For the skill tree, we're just going to have 2 in Firebolt. We're going to pick up 5 in Fireball, as we'll use that for our enchantment, at least one of them. Then we come down to our defensive skills. We're going to have 1 in Flame Shield, if you don't have points in defensive skills from your items. Then we're going to get 3 into Teleport, 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, and 1 into Ice Armor to get to Mystical Ice Armor. Then we come down here to our Conjuration skills, and we're going to take Ice Blades, with Enhanced Ice Blades, and Summoned Ice Blades. We're going to be using that as our other enchantment. And then we're going to take 1 into Align the Elements, to get 3 in Mana Shield, and 3 in Protection. We're also going to take Lightning Spear, so 1 point into that. And we're going to go for Invoked Lightning Spear. And then we're going to get 3 into Conjuration Mastery as well. In our Mastery skills, we're going to be maxing out Ball Lightning, of course, and we're going for Wizard's Ball Lightning. Then we're going to grab 1 in Static Discharge, and 3 in Invigorating Conduit. Then in our ultimate skills, we're going to be taking 1 in Permafrost, 1 in Hoarfrost, just to get to the Frigid Breeze here. So 3 points in that. Then we're grabbing Unstable Currents, and Prime Unstable Currents for the increased attack speed while active. And then we're going to take 1 in Coursing Currents, and 3 in Electrocution. For our key passive, we're going to be taking Essu's Ferocity, so critical strikes that kill enemies or hit a boss grant both of these bonuses. And this is basically going to work in conjunction with Ancient Flame to give us our 75% attack speed, which is one of our aspects, which we'll have on the Amulet. As I mentioned, if you don't have defensive skills on your Amulet, you would want to make sure you actually have a point into Flame Shield. So that pretty much wraps it up for the skills. Next up we have the Paragon Board. So for the Paragon Board, we're going to be looking at Enchanter as the glyph for our starting board. That's going to give us a huge amount of non-physical damage, and for each skill equipped in your enchantment slots, you gain 5% maximum resistance to that skill's element. For our second board here, we're going to be using the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to be putting in the Destruction glyph here for all of the critical strike damage, and crits increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 12%. Then we're coming into our third board here. It's going to be the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Elementalist glyph. So dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage you deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. Then we come into our fourth board here, which is the Frigid Fate board, and we're going to be using the Adept glyph here, so this is going to give us a huge amount of Mastery skill damage. Really important there for our Ball Lightning. Then we come into our fifth board here, Ceaseless Conduit, and we're going to put in the Control glyph here. This is going to give us a massive amount of damage to crowd-controlled enemies, but also we deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. Next up we have the sixth board, our Searing Heat board, and we're going to put in the Exploit glyph here for a lot of extra vulnerable damage, as well as dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 10%. And then lastly, our seventh board, we have the Static Surge board, and we're going to put in the charged glyph here. So gives us the crackling energy damage, but more importantly, picking up a crackling energy grants us 5% increased damage for 5 seconds, up to 15%, also multiplicative. So pretty standard here, nothing too crazy with the board. All of this will be in the build planner in the description below, which will also contain the skill tree and the gear and all of that stuff. So if I went too fast for you, just make sure to check that out, and you can go at your own pace there. So for the enchantments, we're going to be using the Ice Blades enchantment. So for every 40 seconds in cooldowns we spend, we spawn an Ice Blades on an enemy, and that also gives us the modifiers for Ice Blades here. And for our second enchantment, we're going to be using the Fireball enchantment. When we kill an enemy, they'll explode in a fireball for 50% of its damage. So this is what allows us to clear super fast, especially helpful in the overworld and in nightmare dungeons where we can stack the monsters on top of each other with our raiment, spreading this fireball AoE damage to everything in that little radius there. Next up we have the Seneschal construct, and we're going to be using the Tempest Governing Stone, and we're going to be using Breaking Support, Efficiency Support, and Arcing Support. Now as for our other Governing Stone, we'll be using Flash of Adrenaline, with Tactical Support, Duration Support, and Initiative Support. If you do have access to Evernight and Genesis, both of which I have not found yet, then you would replace Initiative Support with Genesis, and you would replace the Arcing Support or Efficiency Support with Evernight. Next up we have the gear. So on the left I'm going to list the affixes you want from best to worst, and let's start with the Helm. So we're looking for something with total armor percent, cooldown reduction percent, max life, and intelligence. If you can't get that, then look for all stats. And as for the aspect, we're going to put Disobedience here to gain the 1.1% in my case increased armor for 4 seconds when we deal any form of damage, stacking up to 66%, so that's a huge armor boost there. If you have a Shaco, then you would want to be using that instead of this. And if you're fighting bosses like Lilith or Duriel for example, then you could easily get away with using the Godslayer crown for the insane damage that gives. Next up we have the chest piece. We're going to be using the Raiment of the Infinite, so that's going to give us intelligence, damage to close, damage to stunned, and ranks into glass cannon. But more importantly, after using teleport, close enemies are pulled towards us and stunned for 2 to 3 seconds, although teleport's cooldown is increased by 20%. If you don't have access to a raiment, you would want to use a chest piece with total armor percent, damage reduction from close, and damage reduction from distant. If you can't get those, then look for max life or just flat damage reduction. As for the aspect, you would want to use something like Everliving. You take 20 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies. Next up we have the gloves. We're going to be looking for gloves with critical hit chance, attack speed, lightning crit damage, and intelligence. If you can't get those, look for critical chance against injured, all stats, or lucky hit. And as for the aspect, we're going to be using gravitational. This is a key aspect in the build, you really need this. So ball lightning will orbit around you and deal 15 to 25% increased damage. Next up we have the legs. We're going to be using Tybalt's Will here. So that's going to give us a huge amount of damage, maximum resource, damage reduction from close, and of course you deal 20 to 40% increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. And whenever we become unstoppable, gain 50 primary resource. So really useful here. You definitely want to have Tybalt's Will. But if you can't get Tybalt's Will, then you would use something with total armor percent, ball lightning, damage reduction from close, and damage reduction from distant. If you can't get those, look for damage reduction and max life. And as for the aspect, you would want to be using something like Crowded Sage, or the Unwavering. Or if you've already got the Raiment, then you would use Everliving. So next up we have the boots. We're going to be using Flicker Step. So that gives us all stats, movement speed, ultimate skill damage, and damage reduction from close. But more importantly, each enemy we evade through reduces our active ultimate cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds, up to 10 seconds per evade. So that's really useful for keeping your unstable currents on pretty much all of the time if you're using it properly. So if you don't have access to Flicker Step, you could use Esu's Heirloom, so that gives you move speed, critical strike damage, mana cost reduction, and your crit chance is increased by your movement speed bonus. So really useful. And if you don't have either of those, you would want boots with move speed, intelligence, all stats, and ranks into teleport. If you can't get those, then look for damage reduction when injured, or ranks into flame shield. And as for the aspect, you would want to be using Ghost Walkers, so while unstoppable, and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased move speed, and can move freely through enemies. Next up we have the main hand. We're going to be looking for a Dagger here, and we want to look for intelligence, all stats, mastery skill damage, and close damage. If you can't get those, look for vulnerable damage or crit damage. And obviously we are looking for the highest item power possible for the damage per second. And as for the aspect, we're going to be using Storm Swell here, so we gain 21 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, while we have a barrier. Next up we have the offhand. We are going to be using something with critical strike chance, cooldown reduction, resource generation, and intelligence if we can. If you can't get those, then look for lucky hit percent, mana cost reduction, or all stats. And as for the aspect, we're going to be looking at conceded here, so we deal 15 to 25% increased damage whilst we have a barrier active. And also, just like the main hand, we're looking for the highest item power possible to get the high base damage per second. Next up we have the Amulet, so we're going to be looking for total armor percent, mastery skills, cooldown reduction, and conjuration mastery. If you can't get those, then look for mana cost reduction, ranks into defensive skills, or movement speed percent. So as for the aspect, we're going to be using Ancient Flame here, so while both bonuses from Esu's Ferocity key passive are active, our attack speed is increased by 60 to 75%. Since Ball Lightning's attack rate is increased by our attack speed, this is very important. As for the rings, we're going to be using Talrash's Iridescent Loop, so that gives us non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, resource generation, and cooldown reduction. But also for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all of the bonuses. And for our other ring, we're going to be using the Ring of Starless Skies if you have it. So that's going to give us critical strike chance, critical strike damage, core skill damage, and lucky hit chance. But also, spending our primary resource reduces the resource cost of our skills and increases your damage by 10% for 3 seconds, up to 40%. So that's going to give us a lot of damage and make our Ball Lightning cost a lot less to cast. If you don't have the Ring of Starless Skies or a Talrash's Iridescent Loop, then you would want to use rings with critical hit chance, resource generation, crit damage, and damage to close enemies. If you can't get those, then damage to vulnerable enemies is good as well. And as for the aspects, you would want to use something like Prodigies here. So using a cooldown restores 15 to 25 mana, and that would be the main aspect you would be going for if you don't have either of those rings. And for the other aspect, you could use another damaging aspect like Control to deal 25 to 35% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. Another option would be using something like the aspect of Shredding Blades. So your Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%, and the vulnerable duration is increased by 4 seconds, and you also gain 15 to 25% vulnerable damage. So that pretty much wraps it up for the gear. For the gems, we're using the green gems in the weapon and offhand, the red gems in the armor, and the skulls in the jewelry. So, we're at the end of the explanation/guide part of the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this guide helped you out. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell, as it really does help out a lot. Have a great day, Hope to see you in the next video. Bye!